Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the January 27th, 2014 special called work session. Work sessions are a more informal setting to update the council on business items. No votes will be taken on work session items. Tonight we have one item on the agenda. Public comment is allowed that is germane to this agenda item. If you wish to speak, you're required to fill out a public comment card and turn it into the city clerk. Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of each item. Once that item is called, no other public comment cards will be accepted. Before we move to our first item, published agenda item, we'll do the swearing in of Councilmember Joe Longoria. I'm assuming we don't have any public comments on this, do we? Negative one?
No.
You never know. You better ask.
Double check.
About a dozen people coming in the door right now.
I've got two kids tonight, as you know, so please raise your right hand. I, Joe Longoria, do solemnly swear and affirm
I, Joe Longoria, do solemnly swear and affirm
that I will faithfully perform the duties of
that I will faithfully perform the duties of
council member of this city,
council member of this city,
and that I will support and defend the charter thereof,
and I will support and defend the charter thereof,
as well as the Constitution
as well as the Constitution
and laws of the state of Georgia
and laws of the state of Georgia
and of the United States of America.
and of the United States of America.
All right, one down. Congratulations. I need to get you to sign that.
Joe, sure.
All right.
It's a work session. Do whatever you want.
Scored.
You might want to,
Now that you're
until
once again an
he's going to
official
swear him in for
council
the.
member, obviously you've been appointed to be the mayor pro tem, so I have a second oath for you. If you would, please, again, raise your right hand. I do solemnly swear and affirm
I do solemnly swear and affirm
that I will faithfully perform the duties
that I will faithfully perform the duties
of mayor pro tem of this city,
of mayor pro tem of this city.
and that I will support and defend the charter thereof,
I will support and defend the charter thereof,
as well as the Constitution
as well as the Constitution
and laws of the state of Georgia
and laws of the state of Georgia
and of the United States of America.
and of the United States of America.
Congratulations, Mr. Mayor pro tem. Thanks.
Thank you.
One more time. Yeah, one more time.
And Joe, before you go down, I think Matt wants to present you with something else. We nominated you for while you were gone.
Uh-oh.
This is fish. Seafood. Fish.
72 hours
I'm not sure.
some training, Mayor's Day, just as yours, I want to make sure we have it. But what I know is that we have to take a lot of courses to do what we do, and just
Congratulations, Joe. Glad to have you officially back on board. Thank you, Judge Hansford. Okay, we'll move on to our next agenda item. Do we have any public comment on this item?
We do not, sir.
Okay.
Our item this evening is discussion of impact fee system. This is being presented by Ms. Kathy Field.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, for informational purposes tonight, we will have a presentation. I've invited a fellow planner, Bill Ross, from Bill Ross Associates, who is known throughout the state for his work on impact fees. We also have Ken Gerard, who's going to help in the presentation as well on this issue. And so what I'd like to do is turn the podium over to Bill. He has a PowerPoint, it's sort of a 101 primer on impact fees, and it's pretty informal. He really asks that you, if you have any questions, to pipe up as he goes through the presentation. So without further ado, let me introduce Bill Ross to you. Bill?
And thank you, Mr. Ross, for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. I'm not here to sell you anything. Please understand, one of the things I do is whenever a city council or county commission wants to know about impact fees, I go and tell them the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever, and answer all the questions I possibly can. So I'm not here to sell you a program or get a contract with you as so much just to answer your questions and tell you sort of general things about impact fees. Is this picking me up all right?
Yes, sir.
Usually I walk around, wave my hands, and point at the screen, so this is going to be an interesting experiment to see if I can stand still in front of the microphone, Mr. Mayor. Tonight, the basic agenda is who are we? And again, I'm not here to sell you anything, but I do want to give you some information about the company with regard to our credibility on impact fees. We're going to talk about the state law itself, the connection between impact fees and your comprehensive planning program. We're going to talk about how impact fees work and some practical experience that other cities and counties have experienced with the with fees. Excuse me. We're a city planning firm. We do comprehensive planning, zoning, land development codes, and kind of uniquely, we get into implementation and financing on those same plans. And as you can see in orange down there, impact fees are one of the things we do in terms of funding capital facilities, public improvements that come out of these plans. Sometimes we do it backwards, but that's another story. Our firm has done the vast majority of impact fee programs that have been adopted in the state of Georgia. A couple of out-of-state firms are active also, very good firms, and a number of the programs we have not done are actually water and sewer fees done by local water and sewer authorities who only focused on water and sewer and didn't really need us at all. Okay, what does the Georgia Impact Fee Act cover? Gee, we must be going on 25 years that this bill's been in place. So there's an enormous amount of experience among those cities and counties that have adopted fees. There's experience among those who didn't adopt fees but took a look at it. But we're going to talk about development exactions. What are the public facility categories that are covered? System improvements. What is a system improvement? It's key to the interpretation of it all. And again, that comprehensive plan connection. I will probably cover stuff that some or all of you already know. I just don't know what you know. So somebody can start going like this if I'm dwelling on something that you're very, very familiar with. Here's the deal. Every city and county in the state of Georgia comes under the impact fee law, including you. The law applies to everybody, whether you adopt impact fees or not. And it applies to the city of Milton, particularly with regard to the kinds of, we're going to talk about exactions that you might request in the rezoning process, the land development process, whatever. But the law casts a very, very broad net in terms of looking at impact fees. It starts, what do they say, to sculpt a statue of an elephant. You just chip away everything that doesn't look like elephant. That's what this law does. It starts with the broad and chips away down to impact fees. Key element of these things. Development exactions. Anything that a city or county may require of a developer with regard to the payment of money, the dedication of land, the building of a road, a major road. We're going to get to system improvements in a minute. These are exactions if they are required in order for that developer or builder to get a development permit, a building permit, or even a zoning approval. So the law starts out saying we're going to deal with exactions, these contributions that may be requested. This doesn't cover if a developer walks in and says to you, gee, you know, I've really been thinking I need to have a fire station near me, and I want to give you a couple acres of land. As long as you were never complicit in requiring it, and just accept it as a wonderful gift, that's not an exaction. That's totally voluntary. But as you know, most exactions aren't really voluntary on the part of developers. They are, you want something from us, we want something from you. So from this definition of exactions, which is very broad, we get down to the idea about system improvements, exactions for system improvements. And that becomes the focus of development impact fees. This is quoted out of the Act. Cities and counties may impose development exactions for system improvements only by way of having an impact fee program. You can't otherwise do it, except with one exception, and we'll talk about that later.
Are we going to get a copy of this presentation so we don't have to write all this down?
The answer is absolutely yes.
Okay. Okay, good. That way you can listen without having to worry about taking all the notes.
And I'll make sure you all get it tomorrow. We have
Okay,
it.
that's fine.
I apologize. I usually encourage folks to go ahead and pass this thing out ahead of time. It's not like I've got secrets that are going to spring on
I
you.
wouldn't be taking notes if we weren't going to get a complete copy of it, so.
No. We don't want you to be able to remember any of this. No, Kathy will get you a copy tomorrow. The law only covers these categories of public facilities. Water and sewer obviously is something that is mostly handled by authorities. Some cities and counties have their own departments, however, with regard to water and sewer. But the big ones are roads, parks, open space, law enforcement, fire departments, public safety kinds of things, and libraries. And the law looks at two different categories of improvements. These are capital improvements. A project improvement is an improvement that just serves a particular development. Like a subdivision, the roads in a subdivision provide service to the lots in the subdivision. That's a project improvement. The water lines and the sewer lines in the streets in that subdivision serve only that development. And those are project improvements. You can still require those to be included in a project just like you always did. It's when you get out to the major road that you start getting into system improvements. Local highways and major streets that may go by a development but serve many other properties. A sewer outfall line is a good example that serves an entire area. Those are system improvements. They're improvements to your system of public facilities. They don't just serve that development. A subdivision might have a clubhouse, tennis courts, a swimming pool, recreation facilities. Those would be project improvements just for that development. But if you're building new parks, buying land for new parks, open space that serve the entire community, or even service areas, but the entire community, that's a system improvement. You're improving the system of parks and recreation. This is an attempt to kind of separate out exactions and what the law applies to and what it doesn't. Here are a bunch of public facility categories. These don't cover everything at all, but they're just 6 examples of capital improvements that one might build or see built by a community or by a developer in the development process. So all 6 of these are technically exactions if you required any of these to be built or funded as part of a development project or issuance of a permit. The first 2 over here, these are not impact fee eligible. They are project improvements, as we were just talking about, subdivision, streets, etc. You can require those. Somebody builds a subdivision, they got to build streets, they got to build the water lines, etc. Those aren't affected by the impact fee law. These over here are system improvements. They serve a much broader portion of the community, if not the entire community as a whole. And of these 4, just these last 2 happen to be impact fee eligible because they were on that list of public facilities that the law covers. Now it leaves the question hanging out there, well, if you do have a system improvement, and it's not on the list, can you charge fees or require developers to contribute to them? And the answer is no, because those would be exactions, and the law starts off saying you can only have exactions if you have an impact fee law, and oh, by the way, you can only charge exactions or have exactions for those public facilities on the list. So it kind of leaves you hanging with regard to some of these other categories. Now, public schools were left off the list in the first place on purpose. Landfills were left off the list on purpose. I can't remember why they left off landfills. But public schools were left off because at that point in time, 25 years ago, the state constitution limited school funding to only property taxes. So they could not have received impact fees anyway. Of course, as you know, it's been broadened now to e-lost, et cetera, but they still can't collect impact fees for schools. Capital improvements. I keep talking about capital improvements. This is a little bit different from what those of you who run a business, what you call a capital cost or capital improvement in your business. In the case of the state law, these have to have a useful life of 10 years or more. A fire truck generally has a useful life of over 10 years. That would qualify. Computers don't. Furniture doesn't. Stuff that basically we sort of go by the IRS rule with regard to the life of a capital improvement. So 10 years is the watershed. Anything less than 10 years is not going to be qualified for impact fee funding. A quick note, this council deals with this issue constantly, the difference between funding and financing. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry. So we have project improvements and system improvements, but the capital improvements are only those that affect the system improvements, or capital improvements are separate. I just want to make sure I understand that.
As I was chipping away to get down to the elephant, only the capital improvement categories, the public facility categories on that list of the eight general categories, those are the only ones for which you could charge an impact fee.
Like you said, the land
And the capital improvements within those categories have to have a useful life of over 10 years.
So land for library or highway widening, the only options, you mentioned a fire truck, that would not apply for impact fees.
You could finance a fire truck, but probably not an ambulance. Now, if you get into the nuts and bolts of it, the body and the chassis are actually separate. One of them has a life over 10 years, the other one doesn't. So you can buy one but not the other. But you can't buy the computers in the fire department. If you can get your provider to claim that your communication system has a useful life over 10 years, that would be eligible. If not, no, it wouldn't be eligible. So you end up having to make a lot of decisions about where's that line, because if you need those things that aren't capital improvements with a life over 10 years, you still got to buy them. And that is why it brought me to the funding versus financing thing. Impact fees are a funding resource, but they're not always a financing resource. The bottom line is the last impact fee gets collected when the last house is built or the last business moves in. And kind of just like SPLOST, quite often you need the money before you've collected all the impact fees. And again, very much like SPLOST, you may be looking at short-term loans, you may be looking at other financing vehicles that you would pay yourself back as the impact fees come in. You can't wait until a neighborhood is completely built out to build a fire station. You need the fire station well ahead of time to be providing service in the first place. That kind of thing will come up. Financing costs are impact fee eligible. If you issue bonds for Parks and Recreation program, the financing cost, the portion of the financing for those bonds that would apply to the 10-year capital improvements for Parks and Recreation could be recovered through impact fees also. It all adds together as part of the cost to the city to buy, build, or provide these facilities. And I bring this up at this point because a lot of folks walk in thinking, well, we're going to have impact fees, we'll get all this money, and we can start building things. Well, maybe. Some stuff you can do pay as you go. Buying parkland, you shouldn't, but you could buy parkland when you've collected enough money to buy the next, say, 10 acres, then you go buy them. Other things like a fire station, you need to be proactive in scheduling it ahead of time. There are a lot of safeguards, fail safeguards, if you will, actually written into the law and would be required in any impact fee ordinance that you adopt. One of them is, well, you don't have to do this. The law allows the government to provide exemptions for either of two categories, limited only to these two. But you can exempt impact fees when the goal is to promote affordable housing. You can exempt some, all, whatever makes sense, a formula or all, for extraordinary economic development and employment growth. Very importantly, the law does not define either of these. It's up to the locality to determine what is affordable housing and in what way might we encourage it through an exemption. Same thing for economic development and employment growth. This latter is the one that, of those who have adopted exemptions, this tends to be what they do. Cherokee County looked at an exemption for affordable housing a number of years ago. A, they couldn't figure out what affordable housing was. B, if they could figure it out, they couldn't settle, but if they could settle on a definition, it occurred to everybody, wait a minute, manufactured homes become affordable housing. Do we really want to be exempting manufactured homes? And it sort of all fell apart from that point.
Can you, excuse me,
Yes.
Mr. Ross, can you clarify? Sounds like if we were to enact impact fees, we could allow these exemptions you're talking about, but does that have to be set in stone prior to, or is that basically saying the governing body has the ability to charge impact fees on everything except if they want to, at their discretion, not charge them?
There's the document that you end up filing with the state is called the Capital Improvements Program, element, CIE. In that element, if you intend to adopt or even consider adopting exemptions, you have to put something in the capital improvements element that says so. You don't have to define the exemption. You don't even have to follow through. But if that's not there, then you can't adopt exemptions. So most communities put a rather milquetoast kind of statement. The key to it is that anything that is exempt, the amount of money that you have exempted from that development has to be made up from other revenue. In other words, you guys. So that's the key that has to end up in the CIE. If we adopt an exemption for either of these categories, that we recognize that we will have to make up the difference. And there's no time frame involved in terms of the state law. Obviously, you don't want to let it drag out too long, or you're going to get to the end of the road, you don't have any money, and you wonder what happened. But the actual exemption policies you would adopt either separately or as part of your ordinance. Communities have done it both ways. Either way works. The exemption does not have to be, as I understand it, the exemption does not actually have to be an ordinance per se. Be good if it was, and it doesn't have to be in the impact fee law or ordinance itself, but it's good to be there. You would make those decisions. Your city attorney would help you make that decision of where it would go. But that's where you really get into the specifics. And there's a wide range of economic development type exemptions. Fayetteville uses it to encourage development in their downtown area that they wouldn't otherwise get. Others have used it to promote development in their industrial parks. Some jurisdictions have just had a list of these are the kinds of businesses that we would grant an exemption in whole or in part. Sometimes there's a formula of how much it might be. Key there is the word extraordinary. There you got to be careful. You need to be able. They won't put you on the stand, but somebody needs to be able to sit on the stand, hold up their hand, and say, yes, for our community, getting this kind of development would be extraordinary, whatever that word means. But at any rate, that is the focus. This is the kind of economic development you would not otherwise expect to get. Yes, sir.
Could you clarify or explain when you said that if we did one of these exemptions for whatever reason, how would we make it up when you said we have to make it up? Is that like $1 for whatever the CIE designated and we exempted that company or whatever for? How do we make that up? What does that mean?
It would be $1 for $1. If somebody got an exemption for $5,000, you'd be on the hook for $5,000. Now again, your finance department needs to become involved with you on this. Some communities at the end of every year, they put in the next year's budget a reimbursement to the impact fee fund for what they exempted. Others kind of float along and they wait for some major amendment or an update to really kind of make all the books balance. So it becomes an outstanding deficit, not deficit, but at any rate, it's a loan in a way from the impact fee program back to the city council. So it has to be made up sometime. Is it made up when you actually order that fire truck? Maybe. Is it made up at the end of every year, which would be very responsible? Or however you feel comfortable doing it. I think the key to it is that it really can't become infinity.
Right. So that would actually that would have to be a payment that we'd have to take out of our operating budget or line item and actually then put it in the impact fee fund.
Yeah. Okay. And the theory is the reason you're granting these exemptions, an exemption for extraordinary economic development and employment growth, the reason you're doing it is because that economic development represents a very major positive thing for the city, for the taxpayers of the city. So in essence, you're saying, well, the whole city benefits, so the whole city needs to pay to have them, pay for the support.
Okay. Thanks.
And Mr. Ross, I'm going to apologize. I've got to excuse myself and leave the room, but I want to thank you for being here and presenting this to us, and we're certainly looking forward to it.
Okay, well, good.
Looking into this pretty serious.
That leaves me able to make my mayor jokes if you're not here.
Call from my wife. All right, thank you.
Good to have seen you, sir.
I did want to ask you one question as far as what constitutes extraordinary economic development. If typical development is houses on 1 acre lots for most of Milton, could extraordinary economic development be considered a subdivision of houses on 5 acre lots rather than 1 acre lot to help preserve the rural character that we're trying to preserve?
I don't know. It's a very good question. Usually these things come up with regard to business development, obviously, because you're looking for jobs, you're looking for business investment. In terms of with larger lot subdivisions, that may.
Because one of the things we're really working to try to preserve here is the character of the city.
Yeah.
So that it's not all developed out in 1 acre lots.
Yeah.
And so I would love to find a way to tie the impact fee ordinance into trying to preserve larger lots than the 1 acre lots that people could build on without ever coming before us.
I can see an argument in which, and this was used for churches in Coweta County. I can see an argument in which, if one were to first of all say, well, under normal circumstances, they could have had X acre lots.
Right.
Because that's first of all, because we're going to have to give them a reward for not doing their 1 acre lots or whatever. That because that does in fact not only contribute to the ambiance of the city and make it a more desirable place to live, it therefore attracts more people who want to live on 5 acre lots, and potentially a business also, grocery stores to sell groceries to these folks and whatnot. It would take some creative thought.
Okay.
But I think that
This is what I had called Chris about this morning, because this is, I would love to find a way to get the impact fee ordinance not to promote the kind of behavior that we really want in the city, and that is behavior that preserves the character that we have of the city, so it's not all lost on 1 acre lots.
Yeah. And I think the key to it is that you wouldn't make them have 5 acre lots in the first place. If you would have done that,
No, 'cause right now they could have 1 acre lots without us.
Well, that's
Yeah.
what I was saying. If they could get away with 1 acre lots to help induce them into the larger lots and create the kind of livable community that you're going to have in your comprehensive plan in your goals, and I think you do already.
Right.
That's how it does all fit together. I believe that you'd be unique.
We are unique.
You'd be
We have
unique,
not been,
but
we have
but
been
I can
accused
see
of
a
being
way
unique
to.
on many occasions. So.
Yeah, but I can see a way how that in fact could be done. You're going to have to look at it also in the hard, cold light of day, because to the extent that you have to come up with, in essence, general fund or SPLOST money somehow to make up the difference, there may be a break point somewhere that we can go this far, but if we exempt everybody in the world, we can't quite do it. But the answer is simply yes. I can see a way to do that.
Mr. Ross, Ken Gerard, the city attorney, I just have a real quick question for
Yes, sir.
you. Would one possibility be that the city might be able to configure the service areas a particular way and then establish the level of service in those service areas to a particular way, and therefore, and maybe even require funding of 100% of any, particular public improvements, such that they would basically be, for those areas they want to keep pristine, almost disincentivizing development there by setting the bar higher and then sort of focusing and lowering the impact fee in areas where they want to encourage growth?
The simple answer is yes. The hard work is establishing the level of service
Agreed.
standards that you would be using. But yes, it could. I warn you that setting up service areas can also lead to having to set up special tax districts. It's rare that 100% of some public improvement category is going to be completely paid for with impact fees. And to the extent that you have other expenditures, you don't want the whole city having to pay because a particular service area sort of drop the level of service in that area. So again, you've got to look at all of these on a case-by-case basis. There's no real simple answer to this one, but it could conceivably, and I know you don't want to, but it would conceivably lead to some special tax districts to make up these shortfalls.
Bill, and kind of what Karen was talking about on an incentive basis as well, is it possible for a new developer were to come in and we decide that we have a maximum level of impact fees that they can have, yet if they leave certain levels of green space proportionally, they can cut a little, cut a lot. The more they decide to cut, they can go down to 0 impact fees if they so choose. Can that be done?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So if they have a conservation subdivision and say 50% or 75% of the land is green space, they could in some ways fulfill their impact fees by just having the green space.
To the extent that that green space is countywide in its application, the answer is yes.
Citywide or
You
councilwide?
can pay you can quote pay unquote your impact fee either in money, in cash, in contributions. You need to get some appraisals. Well, that's basically it. Dedication of land, actual construction. If a developer says, well, my road impact fee is going to be $100,000, tell you what, why don't I just go ahead and add a lane along my frontage? That's going to be $120,000. Not only do they cover their impact fee by building the lane, they end up with an excess of $20,000 that they can go spend, apply to impact fees elsewhere. So yes, you can work out, and it's automatic. You don't have to work it out. But you can accept dedications or construction in lieu of cash, and you're best off using a developer agreement to do it so that you keep track of what you're doing. But yeah, you can do those things. Yes, sir.
Back to Ken's point there too, about setting up special tax districts. Our land area out here is approximately 86% residential. The rest is commercial, with essentially 2 commercial corridors right now. Would that be the simplest way of creating tax districts? Is
Well, I think that
separating those 2 use areas?
it really depends on if those are the only 2 areas you want to focus on. Sort of one set of level of service for all the residential area, another level of service for this area. If that works, then those would, if you do need tax districts, those would be the 2. I want to emphasize there's no guarantee that you'll have to set up tax districts. I just don't want to be standing in front of you 6 months from now and you say, well, you never told us this. The possibility is maybe you might, but there's no guarantee at all. I mean, think of it the other way around. Without service areas, you're still going to probably have to come up with some special general fund money or SPLOST money or something to kind of make up for the shortfall for the stuff that's not impact fee eligible. You can buy the ambulance chassis, but not the ambulance box. Actually, it's the other way around. So you end up, if you want an ambulance, some of that's going to be impact fee eligible, some of it's not. There's a second element to this also, and that is you do not have to charge the maximum amount possible for impact fees. The law says you can't charge too much. You can't charge new growth and development more than their fair share. And in doing an impact fee study, question number 1 is what's the fair share? What's the ceiling? But many communities actually adopt their impact fees below that. And you can do it by category by category. Parks could be 100%, fire department could be 50%, whatever it is that you determine you want to do in charging your impact fees. But obviously, if you don't charge the maximum, you're again going to have a shortfall between what you do collect in impact fees and the cost that went into the total maximum possible fee. So again, you may end up with localities or service areas that have to make up that bracket. It would have been 100% impact fee eligible up here at $500 for an impact fee, but we're only going to charge $250. So again, the taxpayers have to come up with the $250 because the cost didn't change. The number of fire trucks you needed didn't change, but you're not going to collect impact fees for that increment. And if you have service areas, you've calculated in service area X, they're going to need these many fire trucks, these many new fire stations, whatever, over the next 20 years. There's a public funding shortfall there.
But if you don't have impact fees, you either don't provide a service that is needed, or the general population provides it out of your...
Yes, you either have a 100%
Right.
Shortfall, or you degrade your level of service. And as more people move in, fewer park acres are available, et cetera. And so obviously a very important decision you'll have to make while you're, if in fact you study impact fees, is what's the appropriate level of service? Are we okay right now and we want to maintain this? Do we not really have enough to serve the people who are here today and we want to raise it? Or, man, we got so much stuff, we can serve new growth for the next 4 years, so you have an excess capacity before you would need to start putting the impact fees in. You can charge the impact fees from day number 1, but the amount would be calculated giving everybody a break if you have excess capacity. Most communities take the easy way and they say what we have here today is what we need. We want to maintain our level of service where we are, and so for every as new growth occurs, the impact fee relates to maintaining that level of service. That may be X acres of parkland per household, or 1,000 people. You want to maintain that and not degrade the level of service in the community, then the impact fee is keeping the newcomers upgraded as you go along, buy more park acres so that you still maintain that, how many park acres you've got per 1,000 population. Okay, I think I've covered half of what I'm about to cover. We talked about exemptions. There are also 2 kinds of appeals. One of them is called an individual assessment. This is in the law. It'll end up in your ordinance. This is a situation in which somebody says, well, I'm different from the assumptions that were made about certain land uses in the impact fee ordinance. And the impact fee ordinance says that for what you're telling me I am as a use, I have to pay X dollars per square foot. But I'm different. The assumptions that went into that are not how I actually operate. My business does not, for instance, produce as much traffic on the road as these uses generally do, or they don't require other kinds of public facilities like others do. So this is it's handled administratively. This is a situation in which the builder or developer prepares a little analysis of why they're different, hopefully includes some evidence to support that, so that using the parameters that went into calculating the impact fees, those parameters applied to this different situation may result in a different impact fee. And that's what would be charged. And that is not a shortfall. That is not something that the public has to make up. All you've done is recalculated the fee to be fair to that particular use because they're different. I'll use a ridiculous example that doesn't really occur, but let's say that you have a fee for a restaurant, and a delivery only pizza joint wants to open up. They don't have customers come, et cetera, et cetera. They do have people with little cars that run around and deliver their pizzas. But conceivably, that person could appeal and provide an individual assessment that their impact on the roads is different from or less than a standard restaurant of the same size, maybe. The other kind of appeal is you can just appeal for any darn reason you feel like. You don't like impact fees. You don't want to pay it. Your daughter's pregnant. Whatever. You can appeal your impact fee. And in their wisdom, if the city council says you're right, I used to have a daughter who was pregnant one time. I understand. Whatever. It's a legislative action. You want to use it, obviously, very judiciously, but it's not a restricted appeal. It doesn't say you can only appeal under the following circumstances. It's basically, generally communities will require that the impact fee be paid, and then you can appeal it, and if your appeal works out, if it's approved in whole or in part, you get some of your money back. That also helps the developer or builder. They can continue with their business while they appeal. You're not holding up the development process to do that.
Are there objective guidelines on determining these reductions then? And can it
Yeah.
be set up within the certificate?
It's
I guess
cer-
my concern
Yeah.
is, you don't want to arbitrarily give a partial exemption to one pizza parlor here, then a year later,
Yeah.
give a different one to
Well,
other pizza.
on individual assessments, there are very specific guidelines of the kind of evidence that or studies or examples to be submitted to support the request. If it's a fast food restaurant and they've got another location a mile away, they should need to put little traffic counters out at their side at their curb cuts and see what kind of traffic they're really generating. It kind of depends on what the appeal is about, but there would definitely be criteria that it needs to be supported by credible and acceptable information to grant the appeal. If the administrator says, I don't agree, this is silly, it comes to you. It's an appeal from an administrative denial. If it's something pretty obvious, and very few of these have ever happened in my experience, by the way, because I think every one of my clients calls me up and says, what am I supposed to do with this? So you won't see very many of them, because first of all, somebody's got to do a study. See, they don't get their building permit while they're thinking about their individual assessment. That happens at the beginning of the process, and only when their new fee is ultimately approved or disapproved do they get the permit. So there's a disincentive to go through this process unless there's really big money involved. And you'll be very surprised to know that nobody ever asked for an individual assessment in order to increase their impact fee. So the only thing you ever see are people who are saying that, gee, I don't have that kind of business, and let me prove it to you in some way. The general appeals, you would certainly have some general guidelines that you have to be convinced that there's a real reason in order to grant the appeal, because in that case, you will have to make up the difference from non-impact fee money. If I don't want to pay my impact fee because my car is old and it doesn't use up the roads as much as a new car, well, first of all, is that a basis for appeal? If you say, yeah, okay, we realize you don't drive that old car nearly as much as people drive their new cars, then whatever amount you have waived on the impact fee, you've got to make up the difference. So the public interest is right there, sitting beside you, saying, well, wait a minute, because if you give them a break for some whatever reason it might be, you got to make up the difference from a general fund or SPLOST or some other revenue source. So those, you're sort of sitting as a board of appeals in a situation like that. It follows the rules of an administrative hearing and whatnot, and as such, you got to make findings of fact. You have to agree or disagree that the appeal has some basis. It gets relatively complicated, but again, there aren't a lot of these appeals that are ever filed. I think Cherokee County probably has more appeals, like a couple each year, than anybody else. You may have 437 appeals a month. I don't know. But by and large, if people see that your impact fees are fair, that they do in fact relate to betterment of the community, quite often people will it becomes a cost of business. Years ago, I remember, if you get into doing an impact fee study and moving toward passing an ordinance for impact fees, you're going to have to establish an advisory committee. And this was a number of years ago, but on an advisory committee, we had several builders, and they were arguing back and forth about how much the fee should be and and all the details. And finally, one of the builders said, the cost of the plywood that I have to pay to build a house will vary during the course of construction more than this impact fee. And I kind of put it into perspective for everyone of, gee, we're sort of splitting hairs on this thing. Let me move on quickly. Planning connection. You have a comprehensive plan. That comprehensive plan should be talking about capital improvements for the community. Those capital improvements can sort of turn into a capital improvement program, and impact fees are, okay, how do we actually pay for these capital improvements that come from your broader plan? There's a connection there, and it's done through what I mentioned before, the capital improvements element. It's called an element because it actually becomes an amendment to your comprehensive plan, becomes part of or an element of your comprehensive plan. And well, I'll go on. The capital improvements element is relatively simple in terms of what has to go into it. What you really will have done before you get to this point is done a more major study. I tend to call them methodology studies. Other people have different names, but the real nitty-gritty, the calculations, the projections that are made, et cetera, are then sort of summarized in this more simple capital improvements element. One of the things to be aware of is that DCA will be your hip joined partner on these things, and they set minimum standards. Just as they have minimum standards for adopting a comprehensive plan, they have minimum standards for those capital improvements elements. You'll need to do annual updates. One of the requirements of a impact fee program is that everything has to be calculated in present dollars. Present dollars. Used to be, well, these days, the inflation rate, which you would use as the discount rate for a future expenditure in today's dollars, we tend to use the CPI on that because that's about as close to what's the value of a dollar as we can get. But construction costs have been going up, have been inflating faster than the CPI. So what you end up doing is figuring, well, we're going to spend X dollars in X year for some improvements. Number one, we have to inflate those costs to when we're actually going to need the money, and then deflate it back to the present time. These numbers go ripe after a couple of years because they're 2 years ago when an impact fee program might have been put together, the present dollars then are not the present dollars today as your costs continue to rise. Adoption process, I'll let y'all read this tomorrow, but there's a whole process that you need to follow. You need to have a kickoff meeting with a public hearing. You need to put together an advisory committee. The advisory committee has to have at least 5 people, but no more than 10. No more than 10. Half of the folks on the advisory committee must come from the building, real estate, mortgage financing, et cetera, from the industry that's about to get regulated under the impact fee program. You will ultimately, in order to adopt an impact fee program, you'll need an impact fee ordinance. Your city attorney will either write it or he and I will collaborate, but that's a very legal document. It's an ordinance that you will adopt. It has to be adopted through the same process as any ordinance that you have. Included in that ordinance will be an impact fee schedule. So you will have already seen what's the maximum we can charge. Do we want to charge the maximum? Do we want to charge something less? And that ends up being part of your ordinance. Over the years, many folks end up amending that part, changing the fees up or down. There's a diagram in here that will help you understand at least our process. The main thing is that methodology report I talked about it has to, that results in the capital improvements element. The capital improvements element goes off to ARC and the state for review. And they're just reviewing it to be sure that it meets what the law requires. And ARC, of course, is looking at it in terms of other things, other plans. During that review period, that's a good time to sit down and work out your ordinance, determine what your fees need to be, so that once you get approval from the state that the CIE meets all requirements, you come back for when it's time to adopt that CIE. That's a good time to have had your hearings on the ordinance. You can adopt the CIE and adopt the ordinance at the same meeting, and you're off and running. I'm going to skip through this. This is the very simplistic example. I mostly use it with advisory committees, with citizens. It tries to explain how it is that development does not pay for itself. Every year, as new development occurs and new revenues start flowing into the city, meanwhile, everybody else in the city is still paying taxes. And plus, a lot of the taxes that new development generates, half of it goes to the school board, some of it goes to the state. Most of the rest of it you use for administrative costs. So very little of it actually ends up building roads and fire stations and that sort of thing. But I'm gonna just kind of run through this because I have just a couple more things to talk about. This is my final tally, and basically it boils down to people. The seats obviously are houses or businesses. The placemats are facilities, et cetera. And the first people who moved into the city and are here now end up paying a portion of everybody else's costs, such that the last guy, seat number 8, was the last guy moving to the table and buying a placemat, which represents the public facilities. That fellow pays $12.50 for what would otherwise be a $100 placemat. And the first 5 people who were already there are paying, they tallied up with $100 a piece to get their placemats before there was an impact fee system. And then they end up paying $43 for their portion of everybody else's. Whereas in an impact fee program, everybody pays $100. Everybody pays their fair share. Nobody gets rolled forward, and the people who are here are paying more than the folks who are moving in. That's the essential idea behind a fair share approach versus the way most everybody does it now, using regular money. Here's a table that is completely impossible to read, but I did try to put together some information. This compares maximum impact fees for a few communities. What portion of the cost of these capital improvements would new development pay in the long run versus the existing tax base? And in every case, the horizon is the same as the comprehensive plan. It's usually about a 20-year horizon. So this is 20 years of revenue. If you look over in the columns that say with impact fee, that's the quote fair share. That's how much the existing folks and new folks moving in should pay. But without impact fees, you can clearly see that it's the folks who are here now who are going to be carrying the majority of the weight. And it varies from community to community because it depends on what's being charged, what facilities are being charged for, which ones, how many are impact fee eligible versus not. There's no cookie cutter that'll give you an easy answer here until you actually do the study and figure out what it is that you do want to build or need to build. I did some pie charts to do the same thing. Without impact fees, the existing folks are paying most of the money. With impact fees, existing folks are still paying some. you're probably never going to get to zero. I've got one example that gets close, but you're never going to get to zero. But it's a matter of shifting the burden so everybody pays their fair share. So another example, Fayetteville. You can see in Woodstock, the new development would pay a fairly large amount, well over 50%, without any impact fees at all. But with impact fees, their fair share is a very high percentage. Questions and answers? Yes, ma'am.
Just because something is impact fee eligible doesn't mean we have to include it in our impact fee ordinance. Is
That's
that
correct. That's
So
correct.
if we want to do an impact fee ordinance for very specific type things, we can do so.
Absolutely.
So if we wanted to do it just for parks and green space, we could do that. If we wanted to do it
That's
just
right.
parks and green space and a fire station, we could do that. It doesn't have to be our whole capital improvement program.
That's correct. And even amongst those, let's say that we determined that in 20 years you're going to need 4 more fire stations. I'm making stuff up. 4 more fire stations. They would all be impact fee eligible to some extent, maybe not 100%. You could say, well, we're only going to put 2 of them in the impact fee program. We'll fund the other 2 some other way. So you will get very deep into the financing.
Because if you say you're going to do 4 fire stations, you really got to do 4 fire stations, even if the impact fees don't come in.
That's right. That is exactly right. And that's I could not have made the point better. The whole idea is you need the stuff. It would be very unwise to just make stuff up just because you can charge impact fees. You need, and that's that planning connection, your comprehensive plan, the projections you make. It all has to establish what your real needs are to maintain the level of service or achieve the level of service that you want to achieve. And you just can't throw stuff in there just for the heck of it that you won't really need because you won't have supported it. Now, if you want more than what you've got, you raise the level of service so that, well, instead of 20 acres per 1,000 people of parks, we want 40 acres of acres for parks. Now that makes a bigger impact fee because now new development has to meet the 40-acre standard, but you've got to pay for getting the existing folks from the 20 to the 40.
But what happens if development dies way off and you aren't collecting the impact fees that you had expected? You just have to amend your impact fee ordinance?
No.
Then how do you pay for these?
The impact fees, the collection of impact fees, and the construction of these public facilities or acquiring land are hand in glove. If the pace of development falls down, that means you don't need those parks yet. You don't need that fire station yet. You can put it off. If development suddenly shoots off like 900 building permits for houses all of a sudden, you need those parks quicker to maintain that level of service.
Unless you decide that instead of 20, per acre, you want 40 acres per population rather than 20. If you don't have the development, if you don't have the impact fees, you may never get to that 40.
That's correct.
Even if your population doesn't increase, you're still not going to get to where you had wanted to go because you don't have the fees.
That's right.
So they really work best when you've got a booming economy and you've got the impact fees coming in, which is what we currently would have now.
Yeah. Even when things are slow, you still eventually need to provide the facilities, even though it's not going to be tomorrow or the next day that we actually need the facility. But you will need them at some time. So if you charge impact fees, the money kind of comes in very slowly, then eventually you will arrive at that point where you actually need the facility because growth's been so slow, and you will have collected money up to that point. Yeah, some people have called the impact fee law the responsible government law for the very reasons that you're pointing out. You can't really throw stuff out there that is not supported. You can't you can't be charging a fee when you really aren't bringing in the public funding that you're going to need also to match it up. So it gets very deeply involved in your annual budgeting process and capital improvement programming. Yes, sir.
Is there a top percentage? What's the table, and is that regulated by the state as far as what you can charge?
No.
Impact fees?
No, there's no limit set by the state. The limit is effectively set by responsible planning and making accurate cost estimates of what these things are going to cost. And as I said, many communities don't actually charge the maximum anyway, once they know how much they could charge. Some do. Some charge 100%. Others have sort of backed off and said, well, we don't want to really charge the whole amount. The fee can be changed by amending the impact fee ordinance with the fee schedule. I've had communities during the recession, I've had communities who adopted a fee schedule that was zero. They didn't want to charge impact fees, but at the same time, they didn't want to get rid of their ordinance because they'd have to start from scratch to come back. So they just set the fee at zero. I think Cherokee County went to 10% for a while, and now they're back up to 100% of. They're back up to 100% of what they had previously charged, which is less than 100% of what they could have charged. And it varies, like I say, you could charge 100% of recreation, 50% of fire department, et cetera. You could vary, but you have to vary the whole category. You couldn't really say, well, for parks and recreation, if you have a single-family house, you have to pay 100% of the fee, but if you're an apartment building, it'll probably be the other way around. For an apartment building, we'll only charge you 50% for parks and recreation. It all has to be the same percentage. Everybody gets 100, or everybody gets 50%, or everybody gets whatever, because you have to maintain proportionality. That's one of the things that state law keeps talking about, the proportionate fair share. Proportionality. So you can vary it, as I say, you can vary it from one category to another, but not within the category itself. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm just trying to think of it in context of why we're bringing this up as well. So proportionality in terms of population, is that what you're talking about?
The proportionality is the fair share concept. My fair share of those improvements, as a developer, my fair share is this percentage. In a road plan, new development is going to put 20% more traffic on Road X. So their fair share of the cost of improving that road is 20%. It relates to their actual demand.
So I go back to the question I asked before. So if we had 10 homes that we can put on 10 acres of AG1, for example, and we charge an impact fee if that's what they develop, but if we incentivize them into keeping green space by reducing their impact fee, you could still have 10 homes on 10 acres but cluster them. But then we just essentially reduce the impact fee, but you still have equal proportionality of both situations.
And that's remember we were talking earlier in context of exemptions to further public purposes. With regard to straight impact fees, your study will say every time you add a house, you add demand for 1/100th of an acre of parkland. And 1/100th of an acre of parkland is going to cost us on average, whatever, X $1,000, and that's your impact fee.
So,
Only thousands of dollars. But if you say that within the context of an exemption, if you say, no, well, wait a minute, we want to encourage open space, and I can actually see two ways to go at this, but if we did it as an exemption, you would say if everybody had, if we required, or the developer was willing to pay to have 5-acre lots, then we're going to give them an exemption because of the contribution to the ambiance of the community, et cetera. each and every one of those houses could be viewed as still requiring the same acreage of parks as was calculated for everybody. And I said I thought of another approach. There's another approach that, to what extent, and I don't have an answer, to what extent do folks on 5-acre lots not require green space, open space, since they're providing 4 acres of open space right on their own property? To what extent, the reverse of that is, to what extent does clustering all those 10 homes on 1/4-acre lots again create open space? In essence, remember I said you can pay your impact fee with money, with dedications, actually constructed. This is all up to y'all. I guess what I'm trying to impress you with is that there are lots of levers and pulleys on this machine. And it's up to y'all how you want to structure a program that achieves your public goals. Back to that comprehensive plan. How do we get the community we want? And that community you want may require 5-minute response times from the fire department, et cetera. Those kinds of standards. But there are a lot, as I tell folks, there are many ways to skin a cat. We got to figure out how to skin a cat here and not somewhere else. And that's what you'll spend a lot of time looking at, those kinds of things. How do we achieve the community we want? Yes, sir. This is my blind side, so I'm ignoring you.
Okay, I'll wait. Thanks. I guess back to when I asked about percentages. Really, what I'm trying to understand is more the fee schedule. Can it be a fixed fee? Can it be a percent of purchase or development value? How does that schedule work? Is that something we set up? That's where I was getting at as far as what percentages. Does the state dictate, hey, how you can assess those fees?
What you would need to be addressing in the state law is really the goals that law sets for you. Again, about how do we maintain proportionality that's fair. Let me give you an example of how not to do it. And I'm not going to name the community. I didn't do their plan for them, but they've adopted a fee in which Parks and Recreation fee is related to the square feet in the house. The bigger your house, the higher your Park and Recreation fee. Well, does that mean that people who live in bigger houses go use the parks twice as much? No. In fact, you could make an argument people who live in very small houses on small lots go use the parks more. But at any rate, you have to be very careful about that fair share proportionality. It's easier to say that any dwelling unit in general requires a certain amount of open space, of Parks and Recreation, swing slides, et cetera, to meet our level of service. You could get, and I've seen folks kind of do a calculation in which if the community provides its own recreation facilities, they get some discount. They still go use the public parks. They generally don't put a ball field in their subdivision and things like that, but to the extent that they've provided swimming pools, et cetera. I've seen programs that kind of give those folks a break. What you're selling, I use this word with a small s, what you are selling is capacity. You're selling capacity. When you build a fire station and put a fire truck in it, you're providing the potential for service. You don't have to have a fire to be eligible to pay an impact fee. And if you don't have a fire, you get a refund. You guys, as public officials, have to pay for the fire department and create that capacity to provide adequate fire protection, whether anybody ever uses it or not, whether they have a heart attack or not. So the same is true for Parks and Recreation. It doesn't really matter if they use them or they overuse them. You're creating a capacity. And generally, your level of service standards, and Parks and Recreation is a good example, Your level of service is an average for the community. Some folks use the heck out of the parks, others never show up. But on average, you're providing that level of service. People move. The little old elderly couple who can't even get down to the park sells the home to a young family with 12 children. You can't anticipate that fine line of planning. So you're really talking a 20-year time frame of what may be happening in the future and what's an acceptable average level of service for everybody.
But you could offer an exemption or to a subdivision that provided like an open field or provided a pool or provided tennis courts. You could offer a break for them because they're already if your ordinance included parks because they're already in green space because they're already providing some parks and some green space.
Yes, and you wouldn't do it as an exemption.
You would do it.
You would consider it as a partial payment toward.
Okay.
Because it costs them money to put that stuff in.
Okay.
But they wouldn't get 100% because they're not going to.
Right, but then they could.
Yeah.
But if they were willing to put in, I mean, because we do have some subdivisions that have fields as part of their subdivision, so
Yeah.
they could get a partial exemption, a partial payment credit back for putting that open space in.
Yes. Yes, it could be structured that way. I hope I've scared the living bejesus out of all of you. I told you I was going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. These aren't easy at all, but as a funding vehicle in the long run to provide adequate public facilities in the city, they can be very valuable.
What kind of time frame are you looking at if we decided we definitely wanted to go down this path? What kind of overall time frame to actually get through everything, get the ordinance done, get it enacted, and start collecting money?
Generally takes about 8 or 9 months.
Generally.
Generally. It depends on, I mean, if, for instance, if you only wanted to look at one facility like Parks and Recreation,
Right.
that there's less work to be done. Some of it is structural. You've got to have an advisory committee. They got to have meetings. You got to have public hearings. There's some structural time requirements. On the ARC and state review, that used to require a minimum of 60 days. The law actually said you weren't allowed to adopt your impact fee program for 60 days. The 60-day rule is gone, but it still takes them over a month to review it and get a letter back to you of approval. So there's some structural things. You can fill the time, as I mentioned during the review period, you'll be working on the ordinance and administration, how you're going to set this thing
But if
up.
we wanted to do it initially for just parks and open space and get it enacted quickly, could we then later go back and add additional capital improvements and expand the ordinance?
You
To
could.
include fire stations or whatever else
Yes.
we wanted to include?
Yes, yes. You can add or subtract. You can change the fee as you go along. Every few years, 5 years maybe, it's good to go back and do a complete amendment and recalculate everything because costs have changed and interest rates have changed and whatnot. Johnny on the spot, you do it every year, but nobody does it every year. Consultants are too expensive to do it every year.
To Karen's point again, would that speed up the process if we were only to identify one element?
It would speed it up a little bit. You still have to, Parks and Recreation is only charged to residential development. You still have to do your projections of population and number of households out to the horizon you've picked. It used to be the horizon of the comprehensive plan. Now, the regulations have changed. So generally 20 years. That would still have to be done. That could be done more quickly than doing the employment forecast because there's a lot less data and experience to use on that. But I would say you're only going to save about a month or two. But yes, it would speed it up a little bit. But you still, there are no minimum number of times that the advisory committee has to meet. But obviously, they got to meet a couple of times. They've got to meet before you adopt the ordinance. But it's really good to get them started with the whole program from day number one, so everybody knows what's going on.
If you were to go back later on, given the fact that you just adopted one of the elements, would you still have to go through the entire process again to add other elements?
You'd have to go through some of those steps. You would still have to submit the amended CIE to the state for review. You only have to have one public hearing instead of the two. Do you have two readings on ordinances? Okay, so that doesn't change. You've got to hit two separate meetings on that. So doing an amendment can be a little quicker, but by and large, there's so much built into the whole process that you can't shorten it up very much. All right. Well, Kathy's going to give you a copy of the presentation. And if you have any questions, you can call me up. My phone number's in there somewhere. Call me up anytime to ask me any question. And if you need me to come back out and clarify anything, I'd be happy to do it. I'm going to be out of the country starting this weekend for 2 weeks, so don't call me in 2 weeks, or for the next 2 weeks. But otherwise, I'll be happy to help you out with this thing in any way.
Well, Mr. Ross, we really appreciate all the information. It was very comprehensive, and I'm sure it's generated quite a bit from our point of view in terms
Well, thank you.
of future discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brand New Mayor Pro Tem.
Man, you saw what happened to the mayor as soon as that happened. He bolted. All right.
I noticed he left right after you were appointed.
Trial by fire.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, I don't know if Ken would like to add anything to the presentation at all, because I know you have expertise as well, so.
Thank you. I've got another hour PowerPoint that I'd like to go ahead and begin right now.
I just got an emergency call.
I think I'm fine. Thank you, Karen. I appreciate it.
Oh, so you were just joking? You don't really?
I don't really have
Oh,
no
okay. All
PowerPoint.
right. Well, is there any other council discussion that we need to
For
entertain?
purposes of tonight, just to close the night out, is there any, generally I've sensed that your reaction to the presentation was positive and is one that you'd like to continue to explore. So tonight didn't put the brakes on this process, I guess. I'm just looking for heads to go the right direction that says nothing's jumped out that said slow the train. If I could speed up the train, that would be the better thing.
Put some more fuel
I
in
would
it.
add to it, just say, I think it's one arrow in the quiver of the overall objective. Also, if we can have impact fees to direct people towards what we want, as well as providing some zoning opportunities where they can find additional financial incentives to create what we want, I think that would be both paths we want to take.
I agree with you, and I also agree that, or would encourage y'all to remember that there's no silver bullet with this whole thing. There's no one size fits all. You just do this, and then this is the result. We're not going to find that. Right. But we're going to find an assortment of different things that partnered together are going to work for Milton. Right. Commented with the council member this morning, this is a good problem to have. A lot of communities would love to have this problem, that people wanted to be here so bad we had to try to figure out how to keep it looking the way we want it to look. Right. So it's a good problem to have. I can tell you that while we've been meeting tonight, many of you know that we applied, several weeks ago now, right as some of these ideas were coming forward, to get some peer consulting as a quick, almost generate a playbook for different types of green space preservation and conservation. And I just saw the letter come through as we've been meeting tonight that we have been awarded that work, which is good. We'll have a team of 4 that will hit the ground running almost immediately, and they'll make a visit in the early part of March to Milton to meet with y'all in person, and they'll have a deliverable sometime in the first part of June. And what I've tasked them to do is to work on not making recommendations on what works for Milton. I told them there's no way I can bring you into the nuances of what Milton is and what it's trying to do in the next 120 days. But what I'd ask you to do is to go out and find, I hate the term best practice, because your best practice and our best practice may be 2 totally different things. So let's call them emerging practices. Figure out what's going on the West Coast. Figure out what's going on in the central part of North America. Figure out what's going on in the Northeast. Figure out what's going on in the South. I mean, let's look at all different options. And I even asked them to provide us a look at those things which might be regulated legally or illegally here in Georgia. If there's something that's allowed in another state that's not in Georgia because of some law or regulation, I want to look at those because, if things make sense, we have the reasonable ability to be in front of the General Assembly as well to change the law if we need to, or to try to move towards that direction. So this is going to be a lot of different things all hitting at once, and I think if we layer one upon the other, we'll have a good outcome.
The thing I wanted to add about impact fees, Chris, was when we start discussing this in a lot more detail, it would be good to have an understanding of the sort of the overhead associated with this because, obviously, just based on today's presentation, it's got a ripple effect in a lot of the committees that we have. It's got to have some kind of burden that it would place on the existing staff. So we would need to know staff impact for impact fees. Sorry, I had to say that. And so that we know, how would we put something together that could manage the tasks that we were adopting if we were to adopt that. So I think it would be good to get some insight into that whole piece.
We can put together a critical path for you so that you have some ideas as to what it would look like. We can distribute that to you or bring it back at one of the next meetings.
Anything else? All right. Well, I say this meeting is adjourned.